Hello, this is Camp DuBois. Camp DuBois is where the Lewis and Clark expedition stayed from December of 1803 until May of 1804. So they were here for 5 months, spent the winter here. A couple reasons why. They couldn't go on up the Missouri River because that was still Spain. The Spanish had not given the land over yet officially, had not been signed over to the United States. And so the Spanish governor, and I know we purchased it from France, but the Spanish were still organizing the territory. The Spanish governor in St. Louis, across the river, would not allow Lewis and Clark to go up the river until it was formally part of the United States, which will happen in January. And so, and also they had to camp the winter out. Heading up the Missouri during the winter was not a good idea. It's full of ice. It could break apart their boats. And so they're going to stay here for 5 months. Most of the time, Captain Lewis, Meriwether Lewis, he's in St. Louis. He's buying supplies. He's trying to get some new men for the expedition. And he's taking care of the business. Captain William Clark, who, even though he was not a captain, he was promised the position, a captainship while he was on here. The U.S. Army actually never gave that to him, but Lewis always referred to him as Captain Clark. The men always referred to him as Captain Clark, and they were genuinely co-captains, even though the Army never actually gave him that position during the expedition. But William Clark will be in charge of the men here during the winter. He's going to, when they first got here in December, for 2 weeks, it was a hailstorm, constant rain, and they just had to sleep in their tents. And then they start to build, and Ethan, if you want to pan around a little bit, they started to build this camp. They never do call it a fort. They were only here for a few months. Over there was the kitchen. Go over there. That was the kitchen. There was a woman locally here who would cook meals for them. This here is a bunkhouse. They locked up. You can't see inside there anymore. But the enlisted men would stay inside the bunkhouse, and there was 3 bunk levels, and they would be cozied up really tight. It was very cold out here. They each had a fireplace. There was 4 bunkhouses. There would have been a palisade around here, walls, but the walls have come down, and they're in the process now of trying to gather some money to rebuild this. We're on the banks of the Mississippi here, right around the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. And this here was the captain's quarters. It was also on the left side here was the guard house for those who are on guard duty. And if you wanted to come visit with the captains, which is on the other side here, you'd have to go through the guardhouse and be given permission to come see the captains. So the first thing they did that winter was to build the fort, right, or the camp. They never did call it a fort, but to build the camp. And then they set to work improving the keel boat. Meriwether Lewis had brought his keel boat, 55 feet long, huge keel boat, all the way down the Ohio River, and then up the Mississippi to St. Louis, or to here. And Captain Clark was not satisfied with the boat. He thought that it needed some improvements, and he made a lot of improvements on the boat while he was here. And I'll show you that when we go inside the museum. And then once that was done, they didn't have much to do. This is all military men, and even those who were not in the military who became part of the expedition, locals who were still trying out to do this. It was a good job and quite an adventure, so a lot of people wanted to do this. They were all treated as if they were in the military. They would for 4 hours a day, they would do drills. And so it was very much military life here at the camp. But they ran out of things to do once everything was prepared, and they were just waiting the winter out. So they ran into a lot of problems. Lewis and Clark both left at one point to go to St. Louis to do some business. And they placed a guy named Sergeant John Ordway. There were 3 sergeants. So there was 2 captains, 3 sergeants, and then the enlisted men, which the numbers of those changed throughout the expedition. But Sergeant John Ordway was placed in charge here. The men gave him absolutely no respect. Some of the men would run off to local settlements here and get drunk, buy alcohol, buy whiskey from people, try to find women. And at one point they loaded their guns and pointed them at John Ordway and told him that they're not going to listen to anything he says. When Clark came back, and found this out. He and Lewis agreed that the man should be punished, but they were so desperate for men, and the men that did this, they seemed like good men, and so they even though they were punished, they allowed them to stay on the expedition. And so, but the men would get drunk, and then they'd fight. There was a lot of fights here that winter. The Lewis and Clark journals talk about all sorts of fights that went on. They get drunk and fight. They, fight and get drunk. And so, and so this is where they spent 5 months awaiting the spring when the river was clear enough and it belonged to the United States, and they could finally move on.